All right, so I wanted to spend a little bit more time talking about this concept of neurological versus joint structure, because I think when we start having the conversation about that hurt does not equal harm, or that, we can't put too much stock into structural diagnoses, I think one of the problems with the structural diagnoses that we're looking for is we're trying to create a picture. There's something we can see that is equivalent to an individual's pain. And again, pain is not something to see, it is a felt experience. But the other piece of that is like there's so much structure within the human body that is harder to see. So we have to appreciate that we put a lot of reliance on joint diagnoses or diagnoses that are bigger anatomy. So we get an X-ray of a joint, we get an MRI of a muscle, a tissue, a tendon. It's stuff that you can see and you can point to a patient or a client and say, here's your damage. But the other thing that's a little bit more dynamic, but is still very much a structure within the body that can be studied, it's just harder to diagnose specifically because it's always changing, it's in flux, but it also is not as obvious on a picture, is the neurological structure of receptors in the body. And I think there's very much direct connection to if these receptors have gone through change in the body chronically, then you're left in an environment where you're more likely to feel pain. So we can look at things like cutaneous receptors, which would be receptors closer to the skin, and pressure. A way to think of it is like pressure receptors. They're responding to things like deep, light touch, shear forces, vibration, and they're rapid and slow responding. So the idea there is that there's a lot of varied pressure that the body has to respond to. And there's a conditioning process, though, in many ways, just like we condition our muscles to get stronger and to tolerate more weight or more duration, more endurance. We have a similar process that's happening at the same time where we're making these global changes to performance. Our receptors are also likely to change and become either more or less tolerant, depending on which direction our conditioning is going, to things like deep light touch, to shear forces, to vibration. And this is one thing that I see and I'm very acutely aware of now with clients is this idea of being even less tolerant to feeling the ground, so you need more support in your shoes, or being less tolerant to sitting on a bike seat because you're just not used to it and the structure of your body doesn't tolerate discomfort of pressure in a way that somebody who's been training for a long period of time just they don't even feel it, they don't even notice it. You can think of it as the idea of callousing, but callousing has a very is roots neurologically, and there's things that are changing specifically that we can actually point to and study, and you could see how there's differences with those that tolerate things better than others. So another way to look at this neurological structure I'm talking about, or the receptors, is there's an environment that's created by these receptors that make you more tolerant to more things, and then there's an environment that creates the opposite, where you're less tolerant and more things are threatening. So if we, look at nociceptors, most of us have heard of that, is these free nerve endings that respond to potentially noxious stimuli. So we think of them as pain receptors, but ultimately they're more threat receptors, and they often produce pain, but not always, right? Because they're in the body, whether we're feeling pain or not, but it's how much are they present to create a situation or environment where things are more threatening or less threatening. And they can be activated by temperature, heat, cold, mechanical stretch, strain. All right, so some of the things that we would do that would actually decrease pain, there can absolutely be the same things that create pain. And that's why, it's very important for me to discuss things in this continuum model because the body doesn't necessarily recognize a thing that's good for you or bad for you. It recognizes something that is threatening and it responds to that. So the dose makes the poison. So mechanical stretch, strain, exercise, movement, it could promote things that are threatening or it could promote things that are providing a better environment for these receptors to be able to tolerate more things. All right. Same thing with chemical change, things like inflammation in the body. Well, inflammation in itself is not bad. It's part of the natural response. It's part of the immune system. We need it in many ways. But if it's great and now it creates more threat in any area, it's going to promote nociceptors to be more involved in the system, more noxious stimuli to be, seen as threatening. So you're closer to pain a lot of times in those situations, but it's not because inflammation is bad. It's just because the environment has now become such that there's a chemical change that has promoted these nerve endings or those receptors to be geared more towards producing pain. All right. And then if we look at things like joint receptors or your movement receptors, you have four basic types that have been studied. And the type 1, type 2, and type 3 are looking at varied responses to movement. So a slow response to joint position change, it would be type 1, or more rapid response to joint position change would be type 2. And type 3 is more of a slow response to high stress joint action. So all of them are really linked to some version of proprioception, but especially type 2 and type 3. And the main takeaway there is that a varied movement practice is often going to give you the best environment to tolerate the most, right? Because there is this real idea of use it or lose it, and it's felt within the receptors. So if we're only moving slow, we might be promoting more type 1 receptors in the body, but then we were neglecting the type 2. And then when we have to move fast, our body perceives that as a threat. And we might also lose some proprioception that's involved in, these different types of movement actions that these receptors are responding to. And then finally, the type 4 becomes the free nerve endings, which are very closely connected to nociception, is they're responsible for detecting threatening joint situations. So my takeaway from this is, this use it or lose it model. It's not just about are you active or are you not, but what type of movements are you doing? Are you able to be varied in moving with different speeds, tolerating higher stress situations, lower stress situations at slower and higher speeds? If not, then what will happen is that you get to the point where your receptor environment is more free nerve endings and more things become threatening. So if you're not taking your joint through as full of a range of motion as your body feels like it can go to, well, it starts to recognize lesser range of motion, and anything beyond, which had been previously normal range of motion, now becomes threatening. And there again is a change in receptors that happen in response to loss of movement or neglect of movement over time. So one of the ways you can look at it as the neurological joint structure of type 4 receptors or free nerve endings. If there's more of those at any one time in the body, then you're closer to pain. So you're going to be more sensitive to pain. So this can possibly explain why you just see different people who have much different tolerance to things that you might find as a movement professional would be easy or should be easy or shouldn't be threatening. I'm sure if you work in this profession long enough, we're dealing with people in pain, you get surprised by what can provoke someone's pain. And when you're a younger therapist, sometimes you go into the place in your head where that can't have made it any worse. I didn't do anything, but there's just this appreciation that it's always an experience. You never know someone else's pain experience, and there can be very specific structural and neurological reasons that somebody is closer to pain than you could ever imagine because you're walking around with very different neurological structures. So I'd love to hear input on this topic because to me this is something I've put a lot of thought into over the last couple of years, and again I think we talk a lot about diagnoses from a standpoint of rotator cuff tears, discs, and arthritis in joints because you could see the picture of it. But to me, like the thing that makes the most sense to me clinically when I see people, especially people that are in chronic pain, and the differences, it has a lot of times very little to do with the bigger structural diagnoses that I see, but it might have more to do with, the environment that their receptors are in. And ultimately, like we can't see that or we don't necessarily have a way to assess that on the fly, but it just tells me that gradual, progressive, varied movement becomes more and more important. And the more we're doing that, the more we're conditioning people in a safe and gradual way, the more we're putting them in an environment where their body is literally able to tolerate more.